Inside the stories that affect you. This is Inside KELOLAND.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us on Inside KELOLAND. I'm Perry Groten. Tonight we're back with another edition in our series, Continuing the Conversation, focusing on race relations and equality right here in our own communities. Now, Saturday marked the 2-month anniversary of the death of George Floyd, the 46-year-old African-American man who was killed in Minneapolis after a white Minneapolis police officer held his knee on Floyd's neck for several minutes. His death has sparked large, sometimes violent protests against systemic racism. Now, tonight we're going to take a look at what's happened in the last 2 months and a look at how far we still need to go. Joining me now are 3 local community leaders and activists: Sioux Falls businessman owner Vani Harari, Laura Renee Chandler, and the director for the Center for the Diversity and Community at the USD, and the Hurdle Life Coach founder Terry Liggins. Thanks for joining us for tonight's Inside KELOLAND. Well, first of all, we want to talk about, it has been 2 months since the death of George Floyd. Where do we stand on race relations nationally and locally? Maybe we'll start with you, Vani.
Well, I mean, like you mentioned, it's been 2 months, and, we're well over 2 centuries of having racial issues. I mean, so we're much in the same place if we're being truly honest about it. But I think what's different right now is the energy and activity around wanting to change it, the commitment from people of wanting to change it, both businesses, some government entities, but most importantly, this younger generation. They seem to be truly engaged.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask you the same question, Laura. What about what kind of changes have you seen in the last 2 months since the death of George Floyd?
Well, I think, as Vani was saying, the level of engagement from the community and really the nation. I mean, we know now that this is one of the largest social movements that we've seen happen in American history. There are estimates that over 26 million people around the country have participated in protests after the death of George Floyd. And so I think that what I see is that people are really interested in being more connected and engaged in their community. They want to know more about the experiences of African Americans and the history of African Americans. And they also want to know more about what they can do. And so I think that 2 months later, the intensity is still there. I don't think the youth that are involved in this movement and leading it are going to let that go. And I think a lot of really good work is being done.
Mm-hmm. Terry, I ask you, what has the net impact of these protests meant for race relations, would you say?
Well, I'd say definitely there's this hope has been increased again. Like, you think about what the civil rights movement was back in the 60s, and you just had so much vibrancy, so much hope, so much optimism. Though it looks, scary at times, there really is a lot of hope that people are having. People are really looking down the road and thinking about what does it look like if we truly have the system reform that we're advocating for within the justice system, within education, within communities. But I really feel like it's really been we have been ignited again to really rally, to have a lot of hope, and to believe that we can overcome and get like that promise and that dream that Dr. King always talked about. I just think that we're believing in it again, and it's really showing with the level of engagement that people are having.
Mm-hmm. What priorities do you see, Terry, as that are important to address in the days and weeks ahead now?
I think it's so important that accountability is there, starting with self. So self-accountability, each person really having that evaluation of what is the measure in which they are participating in this movement for civil rights and human rights, equity and justice, and then to ask themselves, are they content and satisfied with that level of engagement? Because inaction is still an action. And right now, the sentiment is silence and inaction is no longer acceptable. So the first question is are you engaging? Are you getting uncomfortable and leaning in? And then I certainly talk about transparency being very important, information sharing, different things like that. So I think the first 2 things that's coming to my mind is that accountability and then much more system transparency.
Mm-hmm. And Laura, you said that the intensity level is still strong regarding the movement, even though we locally haven't seen as many protests. How do you gauge that intensity level?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily about the number of protests, and actually the protests have continued here for several weeks since the end of May. But I think we're now moving from the action of protesting and demonstrating, which is something that people do because they want to feel connected to one another, to now those conversations are moving to talking about action. So what are we going to do? And so, one of the very good things that I've seen happen in the community over the last several weeks is there's a new organization called the South Dakota Coalition for Justice and Equity, which is a group of community leaders and advocates who are very interested in criminal justice reform in our state and understanding how racial disparities impact our community. And I'm a member of this, and so are Vani and Terry. And so our focus really is on looking at accountability and transparency within our criminal justice system here in our community and throughout South Dakota. And in the last few weeks, we've heard from individuals really throughout the state who are reaching out and want to work with us and collaborate with us and talk about, what sort of policy recommendations are we going to focus on? What sort of laws and policies need to change? And I think that's really how we keep the movement and the intensity going.
Mm-hmm. Vani, I'll ask you, how do we improve transparency and accountability?
Well, the first thing is to spread it out. The job of accountability can't just be of the people who are most affected, right? That runs contrary to the idea of community. If something is happening to someone as a community, we all have to be active in holding people accountable for those type of things. So that's the first thing, is that it can't just be us. It has to be an entire voter base to say that this is what we want from our politicians. The type of things that we hear from peer time to time, and sometimes the openly racist commentary that we hear from peer from time to time is only acceptable because it's acceptable by the constituency. And until folks, day-to-day people who are just going to work, trying to live their lives, decide to put in a little bit more effort to hold those folks accountable, we won't really have it. The other piece of it is that people are voting all the time. It's not just in the voting booths, it's also with their dollars. What type of businesses are you engaging with? Where are you putting your funds? Where are you investing? What type of programs are you giving your time and your energy to? So accountability is not necessarily about being confrontational. It's not necessarily about always having to go at someone, but it's about simply saying, this is what you said you would do. This is what your role dictates that you should do. And this is what your role says you should do it for, which in most cases, when we talk about government, is for everyone. And so when we're not seeing that for everyone, we have to hold people accountable to what they agreed to the oath that they took.
Mm-hmm. Vani, what kind of economic inroads do you see the African-American community making?
Well, I think there's quite a bit. First of all, we see a growing entrepreneurial base here in the city of Sioux Falls in particular. Now, as a result of this, some things were happening before, but people are doing a better job of being galvanized, communicating, letting people know what Black businesses are available, so people are investing that way. And then obviously you see, the leaders of some of those organizations or participants in those different organizations now having more of a communication to lobby for laws, disbursement of funds, access to resources and things of that nature to everyone in this community and not just the old guard, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Terry, are people more willing and comfortable talking about racial issues, would you say?
They're trying to be. There's certainly some credit and to be given to those who are leaning into some of the tough conversations around white fragility, supremacy, silence, guilt. Got to commend those that are creating those books clubs, getting after that and really confronting their own self in that space. And then also certainly those that are really wanting to seek to understand what is systematic oppression. What does that look like? Understand the disparities and disproportionate minority contact in the justice system. And people are leaning into that. We need a lot more of that curiosity, a lot more of that seeking to understand. One thing I've been clear about, and I'll just go ahead and say it because it's important to me, that the reality of fear that people of color have in this country and in this community when it comes to law enforcement is not an illusion. That is not fabricated. That is a real experience every single day. And it is a must that our community members and leaders empathize with that reality and begin to actually help to craft solutions that there is safety for all people in the community. And so yes, the curiosity is there, the conversations are there, but I'm still seeing a gap in empathy when some people believe that this reality of fear is an illusion. It is not an illusion, the fear and the lack of safety that people of color feel when it comes to interaction with our justice system and law enforcement.
How do we reform the law enforcement system and the judicial system in your mind, Terry?
It starts with empathy. Mm-hmm. It really does. To first to seek to understand and to accept that that reality that I just described is a real thing, and to not minimize it, to not deny it, and to not to compare it to anything else. That's one of the things that, as of late, that I actually, to be honest, I've ran out of tolerance to have it compared to something else. So when the issue is being raised about safety and people dying in the hands of law enforcement, and somebody's rebuttal is to compare that to something else, that is a lack of empathy. It is dishonorable to the reality of what it means to be a person of color in America, and we got to end that. No more minimizing, no more denying, and no more comparing it to anything else. Step into it, accept it as a reality, and then from that empathy, we can start crafting real solutions that we can feel.
If I could add to that, Perry, if I could add to that real quick. Here's the thing. One of the things that we really have to shift mentally when we talk about justice reform is the idea of crime and punishment, the idea of punishment. Here's the thing. Here's what we know. Punishment is not an effective tool in changing behavior. If for whatever reason you are able to change the behavior, you develop significant resentment along that process, because punishment is meant to hurt, whereas consequences can be meant to change. And that's what we need to shift to. We talk to people at every single level of the justice system, from prosecutors, defense attorneys, police officers, judges, COs, people in reentry. And there is almost zero people who are satisfied with the product of our justice system. And anyone who is satisfied with it has a disconnection to the reality and the results of this particular system. It does not produce the systems that we want. We spend considerably more money imprisoning people than we do educating our youth. The results are ineffective, and they do not create the reality that we want. We have been punishing people. We have been getting revenge on the behalf of people versus justice by creating change in people who can actually contribute to society. So one of the first things that we have to do is we have to change that goal, is that the goal is to change the human, to make the human better, not to get revenge on the human, not to get retribution from the human, but to make that human better so that they can be a constructive part of society. That's how we have to shift our mind state in order to be able to change the system.
Okay. Well, we have much more to talk about, including the recent passage of Representative John Lewis. That's coming up after our break. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. We're continuing our conversation on judicial reform with our three panelists. We'll start with Laura Renee Chandler. Laura, where do you see the importance of making changes to the judicial and law enforcement systems?
Yeah, so I think often when people are asked this question about where we start to make change, there is an interest in talking about education and moral suasion and changing the individual. And I think that's important. Having conversations about representation and diversity are an important part of the equation. But we also have to understand how unjust systems work and where the root cause of racial inequality comes from. And that's from laws and policies that disproportionately impact marginalized communities. And so really what we have to do in making long-lasting change has to focus on those laws and policies and we don't want to get distracted by focusing on other issues that may be related but aren't really at the core root of the issue. So, one book that I think is really important, everyone sort of has their book of the moment, but How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, I think is an incredibly important book right now. And he talks about how this is not necessarily a problem that we're going to be able to educate our way out of, that we have to focus on laws and policies. And so, do we understand fully the standards and the practices under which we are policed as a community? Do people understand how the process of internal review works? Do you understand what happens if you make a claim of misconduct against a police officer? What is going to happen in that process? And if you did have that information, would you still consent to that, or would you want that to change? So I think that talking directly about laws and policies under which we are policed are an important part of this.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is a process that the South Dakota legislature is going to have to get involved with too?
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's part of it. It's a local issue, right? So it's about local standards and practices, but also statewide. It's something that we have to think about as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it was just over 1 week ago that the nation lost a longtime civil rights leader and Congress member, Representative John Lewis. Lewis died from pancreatic cancer July 17th at the age of 80. He was an original freedom rider and a close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Lewis was best known for leading 600 protesters in the 1965 Bloody Sunday March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Let's talk to our panelists now about the legacy that Lewis leaves behind. We'll start with you, Vonnie. What kind of inspiration was John Lewis to your life?
Well, I think he is the epitome of the work, the long road, that eternal road of work that has to be done. He is, again, the proof in the pudding, the person who is the definition of a true activist, because he took action. You know, he was a freedom rider. He was with Dr. King. He was arrested 40 plus times, I believe 5 times while he was a sitting member of Congress. And the very institution that he had issue with, the very institution that was the source of so many of the ills that he was challenging, he worked within to try to change, and did change in many significant ways. Actually, to Dr. Chandler's point, changing laws, actually changing policies that were changing the reality for brown and Black people. And so for me, he's the example of the work, and that's what we have to do to get this change. We got to do the work.
Mm-hmm. Terry, I'll ask you the same question. What kind of a legacy did John Lewis leave behind in your mind, and who takes over from him?
Yeah, for me, Vonnie really shaped it up well. When you think about the long-standing commitment, when you think about the sacrifices and the risks that he took for the sake of civil rights, human rights, equality, for me, he really is another one of those legends that will stand the test of time, that we'll continue to speak about and be inspired by, like the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King, John Lewis. I think about President Barack Obama and what he did for people of color to just be an inspiration. So for me, he's another one of those champions, one of those giants that I stand on the shoulders of. And I think we take it from here. And that's all of us. I mean, this is not just about Black people or people of color locking arms in this movement for civil rights and human rights. We've always had allies from all different cultures, all different races, are part of the movement to advance the agenda of equality and fairness and justice, peace and safety. So I think we all take it from here. Everyone has a responsibility to live from his example and engage in this work.
Mm-hmm. And Laura, John Lewis was also a champion of voting rights. And we're coming up on the political season, campaign season in the fall. How important is the ballot box going to be as far as making progress on race relations, would you say?
I think it's absolutely vital, you know, and when I look across the country and I look at all of these people who are out in their communities, who are protesting and demonstrating, and who want to see change, I sincerely hope that every single one of those people who are eligible to vote are going to show up in the voting booth in November. The people who represent us, what they believe, what their worldview is, it has so much of an impact, and it controls so much of our everyday life. And so if you want to see changes in our country concerning racial injustice, concerning discrimination, concerning police violence and police brutality, then you have to put people in office who also care about these issues and want to see changes. And it will make our work that much easier. I did want to just sort of speak to this question, though, about who takes over after John Lewis's passing. And I think it's it's powerful and it's poignant that he leaves us now as the nation is in the midst of a monumental ground shift and change. And I personally believe that the spirit leaves when it's ready. And so, he started his life as a young person, as a young college student, who everyone around him, even the people that he admired, considered him to be too radical, considered him to be too much of a threat to the movement. But he was always committed to what he believed was right, that he had an obligation to act in the face of injustice. And so when I look out and I see all of the young people who, like him, are college students and who are acting on what they believe is right, I think that's very powerful. And I think that it is a really profound way for his life to end as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we are going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with all three of our guests coming up. Inside KELOLAND comes back after this break. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. We have just a few minutes left to talk about what's been going on with the African American community here in KELOLAND. Let's go back to our panelists. What are our final thoughts regarding our continuing conversation on race relations? We'll start with you, Vani.
What I would say is that as a community, I think a lot of times we always juggle the idea of being in between the national narrative and our own narrative. But in our community, what I would like to see is move these conversations into policy. I like to see things on the table. I like to make sure that the community is involved and that our administration and all of the different supporting departments aren't defensive about this conversation, but welcome it so that we could be the best community possible. And everything has to be on the table now that we have people who are, for the first time, having a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. Talk with you, Laura. What would you like to see moving forward?
I think similar to Vani, I want people to just continue their interest and continue their involvement, even if it feels like, you don't see this issue present anymore on your social media timeline, or you feel like the people immediately around you aren't talking about it anymore, or you don't see it on TV. It's important. It continues to be important. There are people who dedicate their life to trying to find answers to these problems and to these questions. And so stay engaged, stay involved, and, really focus on not necessarily things that make you feel better. I mean, anti-racist work is difficult work. And if you focus on your comfort, there's a risk that you're perhaps being performative, right, in your allyship. And we really want people to be involved in ways that are going to create meaningful and lasting change. And so you really have to buckle in and realize that it's long and protracted work to do.
Mm-hmm. Terry, same question to you. What do you want to see happen moving forward?
I want to see us to keep growing, keep challenging ourselves. I love what Dr. Chandler just said about getting uncomfortable. I think if you are comfortable, you're not engaged enough. This is an uncomfortable time for myself, for all of us as we stretch into that space of discomfort. But I certainly also just invite investment into the communities of color, the leadership, the individuals, really pouring into supporting, diverse representation when it comes to leadership in community and leadership in business. So identifying those programs that are minority led, that are looking to invest in the development of minority people, that's certainly a way that you can contribute to this equity gap. I mean, this disparity gap, contribute towards equity, but investing in minority-led organizations and businesses.
All right.
And trusting them to lead.
Very good. Well, thank you all three for joining us for Inside KELOLAND. We're going to be taking a quick break. We'll be right back. That's all the time we have for today. Make sure to check out our Continuing the Conversation page on KELOLAND.com. Join us Sunday following the 10 o'clock news.